Former valuable FD.
Anka ege araksita itigini petti. Surya gini petti.
A very good evening and welcome to this Wednesday's edition of Primetime News on Newsfirst, bringing you the details on Mariam Binamijaya. We start off with a look at your headlines.
12 Sri Lankan women taken to Oman via Abu Dhabi using tourist visa reported missing. CID launches investigation. Sri Lanka planning on domestic debt restructuring. Prime Minister says no provisions for elections. SJB counters saying polls can be held after February. Police chief apologizes in court for delayed enforcement on a court order.
And now your story is in detail. Sri Lanka is in crisis solely due to mismanagement, fraud, corruption and unwise decisions. Yet Sri Lankan women continue to fly overseas to serve as domestic aides, generating much needed foreign revenue to support the ailing economy. In recent weeks, Newsfirst exposed that a group was trafficking such women and auctioning them to the highest bidder. Tonight we bring you more details on brutal modern-day slavery. Sri Lankan women are being taken to Abu Dhabi in the UAE using visit visa and are being taken away to Oman against their will, where they are being auctioned to the highest bidder. According to reports obtained by Newsfirst, a group of 12 women have been taken to Oman by force. The group of women were taken away to Oman on Tuesday, the 16th of November, and since then, their mobile phones are switched off. Shashikala is one of them, and her husband stepped forward to speak to Newsfirst on the issue.
They are kept in an office and were told that jobs will be given on Monday. I don't have much details. My wife was sent overseas because I failed the medical exam to travel. She was taken using a visit visa. She wants to come back, but those who took her want 400,000 rupees to cover their expenses and send her back.
These women were taken to Abu Dhabi on visit visa, where their passports and mobile phones were taken away by the employment agency broker. They were then detained in a house by the brokers. The Labour Division of the Sri Lankan Embassy in Abu Dhabi had visited this house on the 13th of November based on a complaint that it received. Embassy officials had obtained signatures from the women to a letter that states they are not in trouble and consent to work there. However, there is a notable difference between Shashikala's signature on her passport and in this letter. The group was taken away to Oman 2 days after this letter was obtained.
Investigations are underway and we have traced the location using the embassy. CID has an Interpol branch and we are working with them. We have taken many steps regarding this matter.
The Criminal Investigation Department said this racket has been ongoing for a prolonged period.
When the women are taken to Oman, they are handed over to another group and are sold to Arabs. Young women who are pretty are taken away first. They are sold for between 1 million to 2.5 million in Oman currency. The younger the person, the higher the price. The women are auctioned. This racket is supported by some officials who direct these women to a specific counter at the airport.
According to the Criminal Investigations Department, the women who fell victim to this racket and sought refuge at the Sri Lankan Embassy in Oman were moved to a safe house where they were sexually abused once again.
An official had sexually abused them and a complaint was filed stating that he had requested her to come to his house. She had managed to escape. Legal action was taken and an investigation is underway.
එනකොටත් අධිකරණයට කරුණු වාර්තා කරලා තියෙන්නේ. දැන් එතුමා දැනුවත් පරිදි තාම මේ පුද්ගලයා මේ අදාළ සේවයේ ඔව් ඉන්නවා.
The Sri Lankan ministers for public security, foreign employment, the police chief and other parties held discussions on Wednesday over the issues faced by Sri Lankan women in Oman. Shouldn't all relevant parties intervene and take action to crack down on this crime that is forcing Sri Lankan women into slavery in the modern world? That was a report on modern-day slavery to which many Sri Lankan women have fallen victim. Now, Sri Lanka's foreign reserves bolstered through remittances dropped to alarming levels owing to fraud and corruption, forcing the country to default on its debt. Given this situation, Sri Lankans at home are compelled to spend more money on their daily needs. And now Sri Lanka is also facing challenges in tapping the $2.9 billion IMF funding.
Sri Lanka at present is not servicing its bilateral and open market debt. However, the government continues to settle internal debt through various means. Concerns have been raised as to whether the government can service domestic debt at a time when it cannot even settle its overseas debt. The first ever report produced by the subcommittee in identifying short and medium-term programs related economic stabilization of the National Council revealed that the government had taken a decision to restructure domestic debt. It emphasized to reach a collective agreement after having formal negotiations to reach such a decision. A subcommittee to recognize short and medium-term programs for the stabilization of the economy was appointed as per a resolution passed in Parliament, and it is chaired by MP Partli Champika Ranawaka, and it comprises of 10 other MPs including Thiran Alas and Vajirabe Wardana. The first ever report of this subcommittee was released on Wednesday and reveals that the government has taken a decision to restructure domestic debt. The report noted that most of the economic analysts point out that the restructuring of domestic debt is mandatory to confirm the debt sustainability. It said that in light of the stance taken by the government not to restructure domestic debt, the target of debt sustainability is more difficult to achieve. The report says that liquidity of domestic debt had been contracted by over 60% due to the inflation. It noted that if the debt restructuring is continued in spite of the above situation, it is emphasized to reach a collective agreement among the depositors of the local banks and of the Employees Provident Fund and the local investors after having formal negotiations whereby the trust will be built up among the foreign creditors on the restructuring of the foreign debt.
As per expert opinions from the World Bank, Sri Lanka delayed approaching the IMF. Sri Lanka is the only country that sought financial help after its reserves dropped to zero. We are in a negative position. Our issue is whether domestic debt is going to be restructured or not.
Sri Lanka has currently defaulted on its bilateral and open market debt and rests its hopes on the US $2.9 billion extended fund facility offered by the IMF. Although Sri Lanka has reached a staff-level agreement with the IMF, in order to tap the $2.9 billion, it needs to prepare a program on defaulted debt to secure approval from the IMF Executive Board. The IMF is hoping for a certain portion of the debt to be slashed. However, Sri Lanka's largest bilateral creditor, China, is yet to announce its position to cut its debt to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has already started discussions with India and Japan. However, there is still no proper position with regard to China's debt to Sri Lanka. Leaders of the group of 20 major economies expressed concern about the deteriorating debt situation facing some vulnerable middle-income countries and called on all official and private creditors to respond swiftly to requests for debt treatment. A draft of the G20 leaders' declaration seen by Reuters includes far stronger language about debt issues and acknowledges that the problems extend far beyond just the poorest nations. The leaders said that they would step up efforts to implement the common framework for debt treatments in a predictable, timely, orderly and coordinated manner according to the draft. The framework was created by the G20 and the Paris Club of Official Creditors in late 2020 to help low-income countries weather the COVID-19 crisis. However, results have proven elusive and only 3 countries, Chad, Zambia and Ethiopia, have formally applied for debt treatment under the framework. According to the Reuters report, the IMF and the World Bank leaders, along with officials from the US and other Western powers, have pushed unsuccessfully to expand the G20 framework to include vulnerable middle-income countries, but that effort has been blocked by China, now the world's largest sovereign creditor. The draft declaration acknowledges for the first time the severity of the debt problems facing middle-income countries in what experts said was a clear reference to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka reached a staff-level agreement with the IMF in early September but needs to gain financing assurances from multiple creditors, including China and Japan, to secure disbursements.
Sri Lanka's central bank governor elaborated on how this happened in Colombo on Tuesday.
When the government settled the sovereign bond in January 18th, there are a lot of calls that instead of settling that the bond with depleting reserves, why don't we start restructuring our debt and address the debt sustainability issue that already obvious ISB holders of our credit was already forming a committee preparing to negotiate and restructure debt. This is, remember, even before we announced our debt standstill, our creditors were basically getting ready because it was already obvious that we were going into a debt crisis. The central bank, obviously realizing that central bank was no longer able to maintain the currency at 203 on the 8th of March, previous administration central bank let the currency float without having any safeguards. The then government made from the IMF first time realized this was going to crash and asked for a bailout package from the IMF somewhere back in March. The economy was going towards a crash landing. That was obvious to anyone. And that's where soon after the immediate policy package included sharp tightening of monetary policy to curtail the demand and minimize the monetary expansion and tighten monetary policy and reduce what we call the deficit financing by the central bank, and also announce a debt standstill which would prevent a hard default. If that happened, we would not be in a position even to restructure with our creditors. So now we see instead of the crash landing we were expecting, we were able to have a soft landing. But if we did not take those actions at that point, the outcome would have been a much worse.
On behalf of the Canadian Tamil Congress, Panchalingam Kandaya met Minister of Justice Dr. Vijayadasa Rajapaksa on Wednesday. The minister said the delegate appreciated the government's efforts and agreed to support the programs in the future.
Canada, Australia, Britannia, Germany.
Tamil communities in countries such as Canada, Australia, Britain, Germany, France and Indonesia have formed organizations, and we have held talks with several such organizations. They have approved the government's program and tabled recommendations to improve it. Accordingly, we need to resolve this issue promptly. Conflicts and disputes among communities cannot continue. We need the support of all the communities and sectors in the country for this purpose.
Meanwhile, the Samagi Jana Balawegaya says the president cannot gain trust for debt restructuring without a public mandate.
This situation arose as neither the International Monetary Fund, Japan, India nor China agreed to restructure Sri Lanka's debt. They are unwilling to restructure the debt as the president does not have a public mandate. However, he is afraid to hold elections. The Election Commission will have to be accountable if they do wrong. The Commission has no right to use gimmicks to postpone elections. If they use gimmicks to postpone elections, we will come and protest opposite the Commission. Gimmicks such as private MP bills and delimitation committees are being used because the President is known to appoint committees. Do not fall for this. Do not ruin democracy. If they postpone the announcement of the public mandate, we will take action against it.
The Prime Minister says interim elections cannot be held.
Speaking
in Parliament yesterday, Parliamentarian Harsha De Silva proposed to dissolve Parliament. He called for Parliament to be dissolved and for elections to be held, similar to the UK and the US. He is mistaken.
There is no constitutional provision in our constitution to have a mid-term election.
SJB MP Hector Apuhami points out that the Prime Minister's statement is incorrect.
The Prime Minister deceived Parliament and the public. Parliamentarian Harsha De Silva said the election can be held and requested the President to conduct elections. The country's President is vested with necessary powers to dissolve Parliament to conduct an election. Article 70 and 70.1 of the Constitution states the President cannot dissolve Parliament prior to the completion of 2.5 years without the approval of MPs. This also means the President is vested with the powers to dissolve Parliament after 2.5 years. Accordingly, the President has the opportunity to dissolve Parliament in February 2023. The Prime Minister distorted this to deceive the public.
The Frontline Socialist Party says that a referendum is needed along with the election.
If someone says the holding an election is the only solution, it is not going to be the truth, because you can't avoid or you can't forget the struggle. Because there is an ongoing struggle. Now it has been lasting for several months. So due to this struggle only, we can have a position to call for an election. Therefore, the struggle, the main slogans of the struggle, according to the political reforms and economic reforms, it should be included in this election. It should be combined with this election. If someone wants to have an election, hold an election, he or she, the party, should agree to combine all the political reforms and all the economic reforms generated by the struggle, Aragalaya, for the last few months. Therefore, as Frontline Socialist Party, we vehemently urge a new constitution should be established and a referendum should be combined with the election.
We're crossing over to a short commercial break. Stay with News First. We will be right back.
News First. Main sponsor.
25% for 2 months, 25.5% for 4 months. Valuable FD.
Anka ege araksita iti ginipetti. Surya ginipetti.
Ivan satutin inne wiring karala. Wiring kirwe Eslon Polycon yodala.
For your safety and the protection of the wires used in networking and AC wiring, Eslon Polycon cable trunking.
25% for 2 months, 25.5% for 4 months. Valuable FD.
Welcome back to the news. Moving on, Inspector General of Police Chandana Vikramaratne and DIG in charge of administration Nandana Munasinghe unconditionally expressed deep regret before the Supreme Court on Wednesday. The duo expressed regret over the delay in carrying out the order issued by the Supreme Court on the 8th of May to promptly pay outstanding remuneration to Sub-Inspector of Police Sugat Mendes for the period which he was interdicted.
Sub-Inspector Sugat Mendes was arrested by the Criminal Investigation Department for allegedly aiding and abetting former Director of the Criminal Investigation Department, retired Senior Superintendent of Police Shanya Besekara, to fabricate evidence against former DIG Vaskunawardana, and was then remanded. The Supreme Court on the 8th of May issued an order for outstanding remuneration to be paid after taking into consideration a fundamental rights petition filed by Sub-Inspector Sugat Mendes. However, the Supreme Court, after considering facts presented on behalf of the petitioner stating the order has not been fulfilled, ordered the IGP and the DIG to appear before court in person to provide an explanation. The Inter-University Students' Federation submitted a letter to the office of the European Union delegation calling for them to intervene in the process to release detained convener of the IUSF, Wasantha Mudalige, and Venerable Galweva Siridhammathera. The IUSF also held a media briefing after handing over the letter.
Wasantha
Mudalige was taken to the Karapitiya Teaching Hospital to be examined by a judicial medical officer. He was taken covered in a bedsheet as usual, and the shutters of the vehicle he was taken in were also covered with newspaper. The TID is taking revenge from Wasantha Mudalige and Venerable Galweva Siridhammathera, who have done nothing wrong and who stood up for the people's rights unconditionally by subjecting them to torture. Who is behind this act of revenge?
The debate on the second reading of the budget took place in Parliament today as well.
Speaking on the topic of cannabis, when I was working in the UK, I saw how those foreigners use cannabis. Back then in 2002, a stock of cannabis was around 150 rupees in Sri Lanka. Back then in 2002, a stock of cannabis in the UK was around 2,500 rupees. In Sri Lanka today, a stock of cannabis is around 500 rupees, while a stock of cannabis in the UK is around 5,000 rupees. Just see how much we can earn through exporting cannabis. Therefore, I don't believe that this is a bad move.
මේ ගංජා පිරට යවල කොච්චර ආදායමක් ගන්න පුළුවන්ද මේක නරක දෙයක් හැටියට නෙවෙයි මම විශ්වාස කරන්නේ
තාමත් ආණ්ඩුව පැහැදිලි කරන්නේ නැහැ මේ ආර්ථික අර්බුදයේ සැබෑ දිගපළ.
The government is yet to explain the real gravity of this economic crisis. Without doing that, they have presented a budget. This is a mere paper presented by the government and not a budget. The real issue is that no matter what steps this government takes, the people can't understand it.
මේ රජය මොන පියවර ගත්තත් ඒ පියවර ජනතාවට තේරෙන්නේ නැහැ.
Today marks 3 years since Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected as the president. Then Ranil Wickremesinghe is the successive president. As the successive president, he has no right to decide on the land rights of the people and especially on matters that create an impact on the future generations of this country. Ranil Wickremesinghe is well known for the past 2 decades as a person who took several controversial decisions with regard to national security. We cannot allow him to cause destruction through one clause in the budget.
The final rites of the father and daughter who died in an accident in Mirigam earlier this week took place on Wednesday.
Father and daughter duo met with the unfortunate accident on the 15th of November. The tragedy was captured on CCTV. The final rites of the 54-year-old G.R. Chantana Nishanta and his 14-year-old daughter Nevindi Dilshika were performed on Wednesday at the Holy Rosary Church Mirigama Cemetery. A car driver under the influence of alcohol ran over the school student and her father in Mirigama on Monday, killing them instantly.
More news from overseas will be coming up after this break. Stay tuned.
Ivan satutin inne wiring karala wiring kirwe Eslon polycon yodala.
For your safety and the protection of the wires used in networking and AC wiring, Eslon Polycon cable trunking.
Welcome back to the news. Moving on with some international news. We rise together to the moon and beyond as NASA launched its latest rocket to space on Wednesday.
3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
All 4 RS-25 engines on the core stage and 2 solid rocket boosters now propelling the vehicle at 100.
The Artemis 1 launch kicked off a long-awaited maiden flight to send an uncrewed Orion capsule to circle the moon. During this flight, the spacecraft will launch on the most powerful rocket in the world and fly farther than any spacecraft built for humans has ever flown. It will travel 280,000 miles from Earth, thousands of miles beyond the moon over the course of about a 4 to 6 week mission. So what is Artemis 1? Artemis 1, formerly Exploration Mission 1, is the first integrated flight test of NASA's Deep Space Exploration Systems, the Orion spacecraft, Space Launch System rocket with the newly upgraded Exploration Ground System at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The primary operations goal of the mission is to assure a safe crew module entry, descent, splashdown and recovery. In addition to sending Orion on its journey around the moon, Space Launch System will carry 10 small satellites that will perform their own science and technology investigations. The first in a series of increasingly complex missions, Artemis 1 will provide a foundation for human deep space exploration and demonstrate our commitment and capability to extend human existence to the moon and beyond prior to the first flight with crew on Artemis II. Orion will pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, fly past the Global Positioning System satellite constellation and above communication satellites in Earth orbit. The outbound trip to the moon will take several days, during which time engineers will evaluate the spacecraft systems and, as needed, correct its trajectory. Orion will fly about 62 miles above the surface of the moon and then use the moon's gravitational force to propel Orion into a new deep retrograde or opposite orbit around 40,000 miles from the moon. After about 4 to 6 weeks and a total distance travelled exceeding 1.3 million miles, the mission will end with a test of Orion's capability to return safely to the Earth as the spacecraft makes a precision landing within eyesight of the recovery ship off the coast of Baja, California.
A missile hit Polish territory on Tuesday, killing 2 civilians, and both Russia and Ukraine have denied that they fired the missile. Poland is a NATO member, and all eyes are now on what this latest incident would lead to. The circumstances surrounding the incident, including who fired the missile and where it was fired from, remain unclear. Poland said a Russian-made missile fell on a village near the Ukrainian border on Tuesday, killing 2 people. It did not say who fired it or where it was fired from. Polish media earlier reported that projectiles had landed on a farm in the NATO members' territory roughly the same time as Russia launched its biggest wave of missile attacks on Ukrainian cities in more than a month. Poland's foreign ministry did not specify the types of missiles or where it was fired from, but the country's president said it was most likely produced in Russia and the incident was a single act and there is no evidence of further missiles. US President Joe Biden said it is unlikely a missile that landed in eastern Poland was fired from within Russia after consulting with allies at the G20 summit in Indonesia. NATO announced it will hold an emergency meeting on Wednesday. Russia's defense ministry said reports of Russian missiles landing in Poland were a deliberate provocation as the incident raised fears of a further escalation in the months-long war. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces have used Russian-made munitions during the conflict, with Ukraine deploying Russian-made missiles as part of their air defense system. But whatever the outcome of the investigation into the deadly strike, the incident underscored the dangers of miscalculation in a brutal war that has stretched on for nearly 9 months and which risks escalating further and dragging major powers into it. Russia's international isolation grew as world leaders sought to gain unanimous support in condemning its war in Ukraine that has killed thousands of people and roiled the global economy. While the world is on its toes of a possible escalation of the war in Europe, Donald Trump is back to take on Joe Biden. Former President Donald Trump, aiming to become only the second commander-in-chief ever elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, announced that he will seek the Republican presidential nomination in 2024. If Trump is re-elected, he will be the second president to have served 2 non-consecutive terms. The first U.S. president to do so was Grover Cleveland.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
And that's a wrap of your news for tonight, but do stay tuned to Newsfirst as Space Nation is coming up next. For Newsfirst, Team and Mariam Ganavijaya, good night and take care.